Derek Carr, a top 12 quarterback in 2022, as well as multiple wide receivers that I think that are going to be undervalued this year that people should be paying attention to, including one that is currently being valued as a wide receiver 3, despite having a 26% target share and 140 targets last year. Ridiculous. We're going to talk about that and more on the Fantasy Authority. Let's ride. Welcome back in. Like I mentioned, we are going to be talking about some of my favorite free agency winners of the 2022 season. And so we're going to go ahead and talk about them now. First up, let's talk about Derek Carr. Kind of mentioned him in the opening. Listen, Derek Carr, he's somebody I've never really been on, somebody that I've never really been all that excited about. Always been kind of a streaming option in fantasy circles. But I think this year could be a little bit different for him because of all the weapons that they have now. I mean, as we know, they went out and added Davante Adams. And, obviously he is one of the best, if not the best wide receiver in the league. But, Derek Carr, has his own limitations. I mean, he has thrown for 4,000 yards in 4 straight seasons. He's coming off his best season, a career high in 4,800 passing yards. However, he's only thrown for 30 passing touchdowns once in his career, and he's finished higher than QB19 only once as well. So those are things that we should be taking into consideration with him. However, we have never seen the kind of weapons that Derek Carr has had. They have finally surrounded him with a ton of weapons. Darren Waller, Hunter Renfrow is still there. So as long as these guys can stay healthy, I think Derek Carr is in for a really big season in 2022. The only concern I have right now is their pass rate, and especially more for the pass catchers, right? For Davante Adams, for Darren Waller, for Hunter Renfrow, who all had plus 20% target shares last year. Davante Adams actually had a 31.5% target share. That's not happening this year. Darren Waller was targeted on 23% of his routes last year. And then you had Hunter Renfrow, who was targeted on 20% of routes last year as well. And so somebody's getting squeezed out here. And the concern I have is with Josh McDaniels. Like, what kind of offense are we going to see here? Last year the Raiders ranked 5th with a 62% pass rate in 2021. But if you look at New England, since 2015, they ranked 26th in 2021, 26th again in 2020, 19th, 26th, 10th, 27th, and 3rd. And that's, going back to the Brady years there. And so obviously, some of those years with Brady didn't have this kind of weaponry that Derek Carr has. So that is something to keep in the back of your mind. But overall, I think Derek Carr is really solid value, going as QB 17 in underdog draft right now. So really like Derek Carr, and somebody you should definitely be keeping an eye on if you're wanting to draft a quarterback a little bit later in drafts. Let's keep it moving. Let's jump over to the running back position, and let's talk about James Conner. If you look at James Conner last year, he was splitting time with Chase Edmonds. Now, he did get a small sample size of 4 games without Chase Edmonds, where we saw a significant bump for him. 16 carries per game, 5 targets per game, which is way up from the 1.6 targets per game he saw with Chase Edmonds. He also had averaged 22.4 PPR points per game, which was RB3 over that span. Now, again, small sample size, only 4 games. But you compare that to with Chase Edmonds, 12.5 carries per game, 1.6 targets, 13 total touchdowns, which is ridiculous, and a 15.2 fantasy points per game, which is great. But with Chase Edmonds now in Miami, I think there's something definitely to be said about James Conner. I think right now you have to look at him as a locked-in RB2. Now, that could change with the draft. Maybe they go out and draft somebody, a Kenneth Walker in the 2nd round or something like that, which seemed a little crazy to me, especially with the contract they gave James Conner. I think it's far more likely that you could see them maybe bring in somebody like a Tyler Beatty, James Cook, somebody that could be more of a compliment to James Conner. But we'll wait and see. But as things currently stand, RB2. Let's keep it moving here, and we are going to go ahead and jump over to the wide receivers. And I'm going to start things off, and let's talk about Michael Pittman. Last year he had a kind of his breakout year in 2021. Saw almost 130 targets, 25.7% target share, almost 1,100 receiving yards and 6 touchdowns, averaged 14 fantasy points per game. But one of the real reasons he's a winner is because I actually think that he got an upgrade at quarterback. That's going to be debatable for some people, but Matt Ryan, yes, he's 37 years old, and Matt Ryan is coming off a down year for Matt Ryan. Almost 4,000 passing yards, 20 passing touchdowns, only averaged 13.8 fantasy points per game, which was terrible. He was also 30th at adjusted air yards per attempt, as well as 17th in expected points added. But he was 11th in completion percentage, as well as 3rd in deep ball completion percentage as well. So those are some positives there for Michael Pittman, who is a big body wide receiver, can get deep. But Michael Pittman right now just really doesn't have any target competition. They didn't have anybody in free agency. There's been some speculation that possibly they bring in Julio Jones, which is possible, but it's not something I would count on right now. And even if he does, Julio Jones is much more of a part-time player at this stage of his career. Just can't stay healthy. I do think it's definite that they're going to bring somebody in through the draft. We'll see how much heavy draft capital they invest there, but they don't have a first-round pick because they traded that for Carson, the Carson Wentz deal. So, it's going to be interesting what the Colts decide to do here over the offseason. But right now, Michael Pittman's in a fantastic spot, and I think he is a high-end wide receiver 2 heading into 2022. Next up, let's talk about another team that really got a big upgrade at quarterback, and that is obviously the Denver Broncos. Absolutely love Cortland Sutton, and that seems to be a little bit of the minority right now. A lot more people seem to be in favor of Jerry Jeudy, which I like Jerry Jeudy. This is obviously a bump for him, but I think for Cortland Sutton, he gets the biggest bump here because he is playing with a quarterback that is absolutely dynamic, excellent deep ball passer, and that really illustrates in some of the numbers here. Russell Wilson last year led the NFL in deep pass rate at 19% and was top 5 in quarterback rating on deep balls, where you had Sutton, who was top 10 in deep target rate, but had the worst catchable target rate on deep balls last year. It was, because he had Teddy Bridgewater and Drew Lock passing him the football. Now you get Russell Wilson in here, and I think it can be wheels up for him. If you look back in 2019, he had 72 catches, 1,112 receiving yards, 6 touchdowns that year, and averaged about 14 fantasy points per game, and that was with Drew Lock. Now you get Russell Wilson, and last year, whenever he had Drew Lock and Teddy Bridgewater, 58 receptions, 776 receiving yards, and only 2 touchdowns, but he had 29 deep targets, for 6th most, a 15.7 average depth of target, which was 2nd, and a 34.5% market share of air yards. He was definitely utilized their deep threat last year, and that's not going to change this year. Yes, they have Tim Patrick, who's also going to be there, who's going to see targets, but right now, Cortland Sutton's being valued as wide receiver 45, which is really low. I do expect that to come up. That is going to be higher, but I do think Jerry Jeudy is going to be valued more than Cortland Sutton. And right now, I have Cortland Sutton as a top 20 wide receiver for 2022, and I don't think that's hot. Russell Wilson is a big-time upgrade over what they had, and one of the things that Russell Wilson does the best is the deep ball. So absolutely love Cortland Sutton in 2022. And that's not to take anything away from Jerry Jeudy, because I think Jerry Jeudy can have it, but he is somebody who has not broke out yet either. He has not broken out. He has not had a season over 1,000 yards yet. He did have 800 yards his rookie year. Obviously, he battled injury last year, so that should be mentioned. However, I will say some good things for Jerry Jeudy last year in the 10 games he played. He was 27th in yards per route run, number 1 in target separation, and 209 yards after the catch, which is solid, but only 6 deep targets. So I kind of view Jerry Jeudy. People talked about him as like the Tyler Lockett of this offense. I don't agree with that take. I think he's more Doug Baldwin, and I think he could be used much more of the short and intermediate routes. And so I do like Jerry Jeudy. I think he can be a solid wide receiver 3 and bounce back this year, but I'm just much more higher on Cortland. So let's go ahead and just keep it moving here, and let's talk about Allen Robinson. Again, I know people are going to be like, no, you're not getting me this year. I'm not doing it. I'm staying away. I can't mess with Allen Robinson. I disagree. Allen Robinson last year was terrible, certifiably awful. I fell into the trap. I drafted him too. We all did. He was a 3rd-round pick last year, and he was a complete bust. 66 targets, 19% target share, only 410 receiving yards and 1 touchdown, a measly 7.3 fantasy points per game. Nothing that we ever drafted him for. He was pretty much unplayable for most of the year. But I think this move to LA, Robert Woods is gone. I don't know if Odell Beckham's going to get re-signed. If he does, he's likely not going to be ready until probably late October, November, maybe even December, with how late in the season that this injury happened. And so you're looking at Allen Robinson, and Allen Robinson, honestly, I think could bounce back in a big way. Now, obviously, Cooper Kupp is still there. He's not going to, probably see the 150 to 160 targets that he saw, with the Bears. However, I do think that he can still be a very strong wide receiver 2 in 2022. Maybe even I think worst case wide receiver 3. So if he's going to continue to be undervalued the way that he's shaping up to be in best ball drafts, where he's going almost wide receiver 50, again, things are going to change with that as time goes on. But in a new offense, absolutely love Allen Robinson. Now let's go to another guy who I kind of mentioned, and I don't understand why Darnell Mooney's not being valued higher than he is. Right now, he's going a wide receiver 30 in best ball drafts, and he had 140 targets last year, 26% target share, almost 1,100 receiving yards and 5 touchdowns. And that was with Matt Nagy and that just anemic, terrible offense that they had last year. Musical chairs at quarterback. Despite that, he still finished his 23rd overall in total fantasy points and 29th in fantasy points per game last year. And the efficiency metrics are awesome for him. 391 yards after the catch, which is 18th. So he's dynamic after once you get the ball in his hands. A 2.06 yards per out run, which is 24th, which is solid. A 35.3% market share of air yards, which is 14th, and a 1.96 target separation, which is 11th most among all wide receivers. There's a lot to like with Darnell Mooney. And if he is going to be undervalued, he's going to be something you could get 6th, 7th round. I'm going to be all about that life. Year 2 with Justin Fields, Matt Nagy is gone, Allen Robinson is gone, Jimmy Graham and the whatever he was is going to be gone. Darnell Mooney should eat this year. Only thing they brought in so far is Byron Pringle. I do think there's a possibility that they're probably going to spend one of their day 1, day 2 picks on a wide receiver, but that still doesn't change too much for me how I feel about Darnell Mooney. I think Darnell Mooney could kind of be like this year's Deontay Johnson. So let's keep it moving here. Next up, let's talk about some Allen Lazard. Now, he is kind of the last guy standing. He is a restricted free agent. He's likely going to be back in Green Bay, but right now, that's all they got. Davante Adams obviously was traded. They have 2 first-round picks now, but Allen Lazard stands to be the big beneficiary because even if they draft somebody, I don't know if it's going to be high enough for somebody that's going to be able to come right in and just take away, especially with the rapport and everything else with Aaron Rodgers. So even though he only had 60 targets last year, he did have 8 touchdowns, 513 receiving yards, 158 yards after the catch, 1.35 yards per out run, which is not very good. But he only played in limited opportunities. But he did have 2.38 fantasy points per target, which was 6th most among all wide receivers. And he was also, over the last 5 weeks of the season, we saw a big bump for him last year, where he was actually wide receiver 8 over the final 5 weeks of the season. And we have 224 targets vacated between Davante Adams and Marquez Valdes-Scantling. And they also brought back Robert Tonyan, which doesn't really change a whole lot, but obviously a big upgrade over what they had the last part of the season. So I think Allen Lazard could end up being a sneaky option for people this year. I know people are already, kind of saying they're kind of off of Aaron Rodgers because of, no Davante Adams, but we've seen it, and limited sample size, but I think he's like 7-0 and average more points per game without Davante Adams than with. Now, obviously, I'm not sitting here saying that, that it was a smart move and it's not going to affect Aaron Rodgers at all. But I think if they do something right here for once and actually invest in the wide receiver position, I still think Allen Lazard, at least for this year, could be probably wide receiver 3. So let's keep it moving here and let's talk about JuJu Smith-Schuster. Signed with the Kansas City Chiefs. Some of the rap with JuJu Smith-Schuster is a little bit overrated right now. Yes, he barely played last year. He hasn't met expectations since that monster 2019 season that he had. However, he still wasn't terrible in 2020. If you look at his numbers, 128 targets that year, almost 20% target share, 831 receiving yards and 9 touchdowns. He was wide receiver 24 in fantasy points per game with 14.6 and 16th in total fantasy points. So he was a strong wide receiver too, and that's with a crowded wide receiver room with Chase Claypool and Deontay Johnson and a noodle arm Big Ben. So, and he has been, if you look at his, since 2017, it's kind of impressive with him. He is actually ranked 5th in receptions, 4th in receiving yards, 2nd receiving touchdowns, and 1st in yards after the catch from the slot since 2017. And that is exactly where the Chiefs are going to be asking him to play. He is going to play in the slot. He's going to play some on the outside that, Andy Reid does move guys around, but primarily he's going to be playing in the slot. He's going to be the number 2 wide receiver here. So I do think there's some upside here with him. And if you can draft him as your receiver 4, I think there's a lot of upside here for JuJu. And I know people are going to look back on the Sammy Watkins experience and say, oh, well, I fell for that whenever he, was added to the Chiefs. That was a completely different situation. Sammy Watkins could never stay healthy throughout his entire career. And, something we've seen even last year in Baltimore, he could always hurt, always soft tissue injuries. So I don't think that's really going to be the case with JuJu. So I like JuJu Smith-Schuster this year. And again, if he's going to be a value, I'm willing to invest in a Chiefs wide receiver. So, don't be shied away from JuJu Smith-Schuster this year. Now let's jump over and let's finish this thing up. We're going to talk about a couple tight ends. One to me is kind of obvious, but I couldn't go away with this without talking about it, and that's Dalton Schultz. He absolutely is one of the big winners of this offseason because of the fact out of Amari Cooper, out of Dallas, and then, they did re-sign Michael Gallup. Michael Gallup is not going to be ready likely until maybe again October, November, because he just had his surgery for the ACL because he had to let the MCL heal. And so, this could very well be a lost year for Michael Gallup. So Dalton Schultz is in a terrific position. He already saw 104 targets last year, which is 6th most among all tight ends, 808 receiving yards and 8 touchdowns, and 12.3 fantasy points per game, and 208 total fantasy points, which is 3rd most. And over the last 2 seasons, he has been a top 5 tight end over the last 2 years. Anybody that has him outside of their top 5, I am not about that life. There's no way you can explain to me why you have anybody ahead of Dalton Schultz past the top 5. There's none. Still young, only 25 years old, and he has continued to produce. And this is going to be an offense where there's going to be more targets to go around because of the departures of the two guys they have. Now, there's definitely possible they draft somebody, another wide receiver, but still, Dalton Schultz isn't going anywhere. And so, absolutely love Dalton Schultz. Currently have him as tight end 4 ahead of George Kittle. I know people are gonna argue with that. It is what it is, but Dalton Schultz is in a prime spot to continue to produce. Now, a couple other guys that I'll hit on just really quickly. I think Albert O. I've already talked about the Broncos offense, but I do think that he is somebody else that can be considered a winner here. Now with Noah Fant gone, he is the starting tight end for the Denver Broncos. And I know there's the narrative surrounding Russell Wilson and he just doesn't love tight ends. He doesn't utilize them, which is just ridiculous. He's never had a tight end. They brought in the ghost of Jimmy Graham, Greg Olsen with Albert O, last year. Despite only seeing 40 targets, 330 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns last year, and only seeing about a 10% target share, he was 15th in yards after the catch, 4th in yards per route run, and 4th in fantasy points per route run as well. So there's a lots of like here. There's a ton of upside with young Albert O. The question mark is, can he stay healthy? So I like Albert O quite a bit, and I think he's going to be one of my favorite, late round tight end options to go along with guys like Cole Kmet, who's a big winner, and also Irv Smith now that Tyler Conklin is gone. So those are kind of all the guys at tight end, at least right now, that I'm kind of looking at to being some of my favorite 2022 tight end value. So with that being said, if any of this helped you out, please consider hitting that like and subscribe button. I really appreciate everybody checking it out. We will catch you on the next one. Bye.